Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Freshfields. Welcome back to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. This week, we're saying hello again to Rose Walker, the one and only Rose Walker from Bloomberg Tax. Hello, Rose.
Hello, Meg. That's a lovely introduction.
How have you been?
Yeah, not too bad. Thank you. It's really good to be back. Thank you for having me on again.
It's been a while, so it's good to have you back. Today, we're just kind of going to talk about various stories that happened in the last few weeks, but from like a culture perspective and how, things might be changing or, how firms are coping with adapting their culture based on what's happening. So let's just kind of start off. Do you want to start off with kind of the Freshfields rebrand and all of the points around that? Because I actually think brand does take a big role in dictating the culture, especially when you've got a firm like that that's been making moves towards opening in a bigger, like in another market, and it's been quite clear in recent years what they're trying to achieve in the US. So obviously that will have repercussions, primarily on remuneration, and so therefore on the wider culture, especially in Europe. I'll leave the floor up to you to start with.
Sure. So culture is one of those evergreen topics at law firms and within big law. Depending on what's kind of been in the news cycle, culture gets paid more attention to. So, if there's been a report of someone being, kind of overworked or having some kind of health crisis at a big law firm, I think that always puts culture back in the spotlight. But I think it's it's something that everyone thinks about. It's something we all think about in our own daily work lives. So it's kind of an evergreen topic. And I think culture can be viewed kind of at a macro and a micro level. So macro is what a business states are its kind of goals and values.
Yeah.
So that let's take Freshfields, that is, we want to be a global elite firm. We want to be hitting the best clients. We want to shake off this kind of magic circle moniker.
Yeah.
So that's sort of macro. But then micro is how do those kind of business goals trickle down into day-to-day individual interactions. So macro is quite easy for a business to set and be clear on. It's quite easy for a firm to make kind of bold statements. But at a micro level, it's much harder for firms to kind of embed that culture and police it. So with Freshfields, that also means difficult decisions have to be taken. So last year, they made the announcement that they were going to not report their financials at the same time as all the other UK firms.
Correct, yeah.
Which kicks off quite a big fuss. A lot of journalists, myself included, kind of weren't too impressed by that. It could be interpreted as lack of transparency, but they were clear at the time about their, apparent kind of what they wanted the impression to be, which was we are not viewing ourselves as a UK firm, therefore we are not doing what other UK firms do.
Yeah.
So okay, fair enough if that's the argument. And then like you said a few weeks ago, they've gone for another step in this kind of rebrand, where they've rolled out a new logo, which is a very kind of bold, punchy font, and they've also knocked off 2/3 of their name. So they were Freshfields Bruckhaus Döringer, German and Austrian firm names that were merged with legacy UK Freshfields. I think I've got that right. And now they're just going to be known as Freshfields. And I have to say, the font immediately made me think of Paul Weiss. And whether that's because I've looked at Paul Weiss's logo, 1,000 times this past year.
Haven't we all?
Exactly. It's seared into my corneas. And I actually heard from someone at the firm who was like, wow, I love that you thought of that. And I thought, okay. But it's true, it's punchy, it's bold, it makes an impact. It's miles away from the traditional, kind of stretched out font, Freshfields Bruckhaus Döringer in blue with the angel symbol. And so that's a very clear statement. So that's kind of macro business statement. We are here, we are bold, we want to be thought of as an American sort of leaning firm, global elite. But on a micro level, how has the firm told its partners about that change? How has it dealt with particularly the German and Austrian and sort of wider continental Europe partners in terms of making sure that, you know, they don't feel left out, they don't feel ignored, you know, everyone is human at the end of the day. Lawyers are not robots, despite how some of them may act. And I read a piece in law.com, I think last week, about Georgia Dawson saying, who's the Freshfields senior partner, saying, you know, our European continental Europe practice is still a crown jewel of our business. And I thought that is a phrase which has been chosen very deliberately to make sure that people think, okay, so the firm is still respecting and still the kind of views that part of the business with a lot of worth, which may have, you know, smoothed a few ruffled feathers in terms of how the brand is shifting.
Yeah. But then again, I think especially maybe the older partners and maybe a bit more conservative and maybe a bit more traditional, let's say, I think still, especially on the continent, I think that might have been a bit difficult to swallow. And I wonder how long it took them actually to come to that decision towards it, because I'm not surprised that the names are dropped. Everyone was calling it Freshfields already. So I think people saw it coming. I think there's a difference between having the full name and then just people casually calling it that and people being fine with that, and then just dropping the identities of two of the key people from the firm. And I think that might be quite difficult for people internally. I don't know, it's an interesting one. I think on the branding side, what I felt was really interesting was, again, the font, the fact that the former font was quite traditional and kind of, it felt quite, in a good way, elitist, if that makes sense, like very, you know, classy and,
sure,
you know, and now it looks, very modern. You can tell like they're targeting a very
in your face, bold, punchy, we are here, we want to, you know, act for you. You can see it all in that, you know, I mean, whoever came up with the font is, they clearly, you know, got the message across.
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting. I mean, it made sense to me to remove the little angel. I didn't know the story behind it. I learned about it in the stories that came out. But I guess, I mean, fair enough. I think that makes quite a lot of sense. But yeah, I do think it does reflect kind of wider, different commitments and a different identity completely. And I wonder if actually, how is that going to translate, as you say, day to day? Does that mean that actually they're going to be implementing stuff for their younger generations that they've not done before? You know, I really wonder, because that's the way the font and the brand is like appeared to me, felt like they really want to appeal to a certain type of person, like a certain demographic.
Yeah, and I think they do. I think they do want that kind of bold, you know, grab that piece of client work, you know, tackle that client, pitch that, you know, kind of almost aggressive. You might, I mean, you know, I mean, as much as you can describe a font as aggressive, I might be getting a bit sucked down the kind of, you know, marketing whirlpool, but you know, I think it does say a lot, and it clearly says what they want it to say, I think.
And I think it's really interesting that obviously their kind of transition towards a more, like, I mean, I guess for them it's global, but clearly it's to appeal to Americans. Yes. That was very clear to, I think, a lot of us. It's interesting because I think we're seeing a lot of that across the market as well. I don't think it's just them, and I think there's just an Americanization.
Yeah, and you know,
firms.
It goes back to, again, another evergreen topic, which is kind of, you know, how does the UK elite adapt and catch up with the US marketplace, which I think leads us into kind of another story that we wanted to talk about.
Correct. So obviously, A&O Shearman, big merger, everyone knows about it. But obviously, I think that there's been more action lately with, you know, cutting the Joburg office after close to 10 years, which obviously made a lot of noise, in particular in law.com. I think Alfred, who was talking to people on the ground. I think did some excellent reporting there, in kind of getting reactions fresh off the announcement. So it was actually really interesting in those terms. And I think it's interesting because that story, there was a story in the FT a few weeks ago about some diverse lawyers that were asked to be on kind of panel for pitches to clients, but then were not part of the teams working on the projects once the project came through. And they were just saying, this is all virtue signaling and kind of, I can't remember what the term they used in the story, but I think, I can't remember exactly, but you get what I mean, where basically they felt obviously used. Yeah. And in the Lotto.com story, one of the people at the firm in Johannesburg said that basically was, they were just basically using the African population for like that kind of thing as well, and got rid of that as soon as it got financially quite complicated, which I thought was such a really strong statement to make. And I think it just highlighted the upset of the entire office.
Yeah, I think that's another good example of the kind of macro trickling down into micro impact, right? So, A&O Shearman, they've done this big, bold merger, and there's always going to be, what they would call fat trimming, realignment. Basically people are going to lose their jobs because they don't make the firm enough money.
Sure.
So that's going to happen in any kind of business, and they're not always going to be kind of happy clappy. I know A&O Shearman probably had a sort of 3-line whip internally when the merger went live. Everyone do a positive LinkedIn announcement about how thrilled you are. We all saw them covering our LinkedIn posts for weeks on end. But that is going to run out, and ultimately hard choices have to be made. But in terms of how those choices are explained to your business, to your people, yes, like you said, it was the office anniversary, or was almost the 10-year anniversary.
Yeah.
That is at best unfortunate timing.
Yeah.
And I would be interested to know how long conversations had been ongoing, because the day we all read the news obviously is not the day,
of course,
that people internally read the news. But of course there's going to be a lot of upset. And like you said, if a reporter can speak to people on the ground, kind of still reeling from this, from the news that they are going to have to seek another job elsewhere, that's going to really hit a kind of emotional punch. And it's interesting, and I think a very valid point about, the office from a diversity perspective.
Yeah.
People are going to feel pretty snubbed and let down. And again, I think I saw a story saying that a lot of the firm was moving to a local kind of elite South African firm.
Yeah.
So, hopefully, again, going back to kind of relationship with managers, associates will be looked after by their manager, and their manager will kind of get them out and into a good position.
Yeah, it's I think this one's particularly tricky again, and in that announcement, at the same time announcing that you're cutting 10% of your equity.
Exactly.
And that was announced to the equity partners on the day, literally probably an hour or two before the announcement went to the press.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I would have thought they would have had more time than that, but equally things like that do leak very quickly.
Yeah,
so
that would have leaked very quickly.
Right.
So it's just really, I think that's really, I mean, again, it's not a surprise because you would expect something like that in those situations. But again, it kind of,
it's hard after we are one firm, we are moving forward, we have so many great synergies. But then actually I'd be very interested to look at the breakdown of the partners who leave, if it's possible to strip out who is left because of those cuts, and see from which partnership, from which legacy partnership they are coming from. Because I think that will tell a story, but we won't speculate when it comes to that.
No, and I think also what type of practice as well they're part in, because it might just be particular people from a particular practice. I mean, they hired a couple of private equity people from Sidley recently, which when I saw that I thought, interesting because I mean A&O was not necessarily known to be a big P kind of place. Shearman, fair enough, to an extent, but it was kind of, I was a bit surprised by that, and it kind of, you can see them making moves towards a different market. So I don't know, I'd be really interested to see that. But again, yeah, as you said, I think the way that might have been communicated internally, I mean, I think it's always tricky.
Yeah,
to handle these things.
Edicts come from high up aboves. It's really the people you work with on a day-to-day basis. It's their responsibility to embed things, and that's not only the negative stuff. That's things like if there's like a diverse hiring policy or approach to mental health. Let's say it doesn't actually matter almost what is sort of on your company's culture page on the website or what your head of division says. If your line manager doesn't offer the right support, then that business policy has essentially failed. Culture has to be embedded at every single level by every single person. And that is a really big business task. And it's something that can't easily be tracked, right? Unless businesses ask direct questions about it and are prepared to get direct and clear feedback.
Yeah.
And if people do walk as a result of cultural negativity, then businesses of all sorts have to turn around and think, right, there's a problem here. How do we tackle it? So it's firms and all businesses who say, right, there's a problem, we're going to improve it.
Yeah.
That kind of, I think, get the most respect from market, and people talk, right? Ex-employees talk.
Yeah.
We know this as journalists and ex-journalists. If your ex-employees are unhappy with a manager or a, senior leader, they're going to talk about it in the market and people are going to know that. So it doesn't matter how much sort of fluff you put on your website.
Oh, yeah.
People know what is really going on within all sorts of businesses.
Yeah.
And the thing is with law firms is they're all very keen to say, we have a fantastic culture.
Okay, what does that mean?
Right.
Yeah.
What does that mean? How many times have me and you sat, how many times have you now on the other side sat and listened to a firm and you've probably thought, well, how are we going to actually display your positive culture?
Yeah.
So I spoke to McDermott's London managing partner this week, Ayman Mahmood, and I was writing about a new hire they've brought in from KPMG on the tax side. And we were then talking about wider office growth. And I said, the firm's recently raised its London associate newly qualified salaries to $225,000. And that's top of market. That's what Paul Weiss, that's what Cravat's paying. Huge, huge money. And I said, okay, you've definitely ticked the money side of things. But what about culture? And he said, well, we have a very positive culture. And I sort of did a big intake of breath. And he said, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, what does that mean? And it was actually pleasantly surprising because he was able to point to a couple of things that were really solid examples of positive culture. So the firm gives all lawyers 25 hours of billable hour credit that they can use for well-being activities. So that includes things like mindfulness, might be going to the gym. I would probably use it to have several naps. But, that's something solid, right? That's actually the firm putting their money where their mouth is.
Yeah.
And another thing he said was the London office associates had a recent visit from a career advisor. I'm not sure whether that was an internal career advisor or someone they'd kind of brought in externally, and sort of done a talk. And then there were loads of follow-up conversations that had been organised. And, these associates looking for career advice won't just be talking about how can I improve my career at McDermott. They will be talking about what's the next step in their career. So actually the firm is putting sort of a positive commitment to helping their lawyers grow on the round, as well as just as a sort of cog in their machine, would be my positive look at it. And it was really quite, reassuring to hear that there were some solid things going on there.
It's super interesting. I mean, the fact that, clearly well-being this year in particular came back kind of quite strongly for the right reasons. It is a stressful industry.
Right. No one's going to go into law for an easy lifestyle. Oh. That's just not going to happen.
No.
But there's a difference between being, being a hard worker and being under a fair amount of stress and, it's slipping over into illness caused by your job. There is a big gap in that.
Yeah, definitely. And it's good to see that, they're trying to implement things. And I think, you can always do a lot more, but I think every step along the way is the right step to make. Exactly. So even if it seems small, I see that often in the legal press when, firms are advertising what they're doing for, D&I or whatever it may be. And sometimes they kind of sometimes people will be like, well, I'm not going to cover that because actually it's not in line with what the others are doing. But it's like, well, yeah, but actually for that firm, it might actually be quite a big step for them already, and that's a building block to something else. So it's really interesting what they're doing at McDermott, and I've not really heard that from anyone else before.
And Eamon Mahmood did say, he said he thinks they're the only, he hasn't heard of this as something that other firms are doing. So, it's great advertising for the firm, but I really got the sense that this was something that he was genuinely passionate about. On that note of sort of firms doing, some kind of random events, I was speaking to a senior partner at a law firm recently, and he had been extremely sceptical of the firm having a puppy day. So you might remember.
Interesting, yeah.
There are a few kind of, it was very common among UK universities a few years ago to kind of bring in puppies for like puppy therapy. You run around with a bunch of golden retrievers and feel less depressed about the state of the world. And he was really sceptical. He said to me, Rose, I was really sceptical. But he said, but everyone loved it. And there was a nice buzz around the office. People were saying, hey, did you cuddle that puppy? So actually, it was a good thing. He sort of begrudgingly admitted, yeah. He also he thinks of running teams as sort of compared to a football club. So you train together, play together, have fun together, as well as sometimes you lose the match, you fail together, which I thought was quite a good way of thinking about it, despite not being a football gal myself.
No, it is, to be fair. And I think there's just creative ways to think about these things and across all different levels of your business. And I think sometimes firms can get in the habit of looking at KPIs. Do you remember like in the DNI kind of 2-3 years ago when everyone was like coming out with all these targets being like, 25% of our partnership will be women and all that stuff. And it's like, that's great. I'm pretty sure if we speak to them next year or the year afterwards, the cutoff date for that KPI to be met, I think probably most of them will not have met it.
No,
let's be honest.
You're totally right. A lot of firms roll those out and then, in sort of before 2020 and then said, we will have achieved this by, X date 2021. Of course, we would then phone up and say, okay, so have you hit the target? We would then run a story saying, X has failed to reach the target. So actually, I'd be interested if firms have now stopped externally announcing. It's hard, right? Because they want to show accountability. But of course, they are putting themselves up for scrutiny, which I think is how it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think there's anything wrong with necessarily having targets, but actually, first of all, are they realistic? And I think some of them just decide to do that because they've seen a competitor do it and they're like, we gotta,
it's a number that sounds good.
Exactly. And it's just like, okay, well, actually, how many of your, recruitment is from, like...
And what are you doing with women or another protected characteristic when you actually get them in? Are you helping people? If a member of your staff has a mental health issue, are you actually thinking about how best to support them? Or frankly, are you hiring them in, ticking a box and then forgetting about them? That's the problem. And you can see that when a bunch of women leave a law firm or a business, you can see exactly what's happened there.
Definitely. And I think a lot of that is, I think part of the issue is that there's part of it is remuneration, where we're seeing, for the firms that do report on kind of ethnic gap and all that, I think you do see the problem there.
Yeah.
But then even just in terms of who you're bringing on your team onto a particular project, and I think we're still seeing these like, not necessarily microaggressions, but like subconscious bias and that kind of stuff. And I think even just day to day, you might have 25% of your partnership that's female, but actually, if you don't have the right elements of, your maternity leave policies and coming back to work policies and whatever it may be to actually cater for that percentage and all of the other women part of the firm at business development level or lawyer level, whatever it may be, are you actually really, what are you saying? Like, are you just favoring a figure to look good rather than actually having a culture that is genuinely, inclusive.
It's the long term. You're right. You're completely right. And it goes back to what you were saying about, black lawyers, for example, saying, well, I was rolled out for the kind of pitch for this client, and then I frankly never got any work from them. And we've had conversations with that with, with in-house lawyers who have said that is a real bugbear for us because it's very evident.
I bet, yeah.
Actually, I've just thought of a good example of sort of a relationship between a junior and a senior lawyer, as in working relationship, which has paid off dividends. So when Fatima or Jayla, who's a partner who moved from Sidley Austin to McDermott, again, a shout out for McDermott really, earlier this year, they put in their official comms lines that she, part of her decision was because she'd always flourished under the leadership of Graham White, who the firm had recently hired back. And I really thought that was something special because there you go, that is pointing at a relationship which I think began when she was an associate at Kirkland, and Graham White was leading the team there. And I've spoken to her about that, externally, and I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying, that was a really key when she was forming that kind of very nascent, her standing as a lawyer, to have someone in your corner who is really backing you and mentoring you, supporting you. Yeah. You never forget that.
I'm sure.
And it's the same with all industries. You always forget people have looked out for you. So yeah, that's something that maybe more partners should shout out who sort of has supported them previously.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely. I actually think it says a lot, sometimes when we write, for example, the submissions for our clients around, rising stars and stuff like that, quite often there's a line around, who'd you consider a mentor, who'd you look up to? And sometimes it's funny because you do see names that come back quite often. Yeah. And even when you see the final published lists, you do actually see the names. And it's interesting. You can really tell. That's only for private equity, for example, but there's other examples. But do you know what I mean? It's really fascinating. I've spoken to a restructuring lawyer, again, a female lawyer who, restructuring is awfully male. Yeah. Both on the client side, but also, just in the law firms. And, the guys that she's worked with before, she was saying, have been amazing mentors. And, she moved firms, and those people that she hadn't worked with for a while had given a phone call to the person running the team in the US saying, you have to hire this woman. Because,
there you go.
And I'm just like, this is nice to see that kind of...
Yeah, that's what we call male allyship in action.
Even when you're competitors at that point, I'm just like, good on you boys.
More of this, please, men. Yes.
More of this. And again, that would apply to, any protected characteristic. And I think, a lot of times firms just think in terms of numbers and they don't actually think in terms of practicalities of day-to-day life.
Yes. And I was thinking, and, this is a little bit soppy of me, but I think it's a good point, is again, it goes back to sort of what you have on your masthead or, what you have as your business kind of value statement or whatever they call it. You actually only really test the temperament of a business when shit hits the fan. Yeah. It is only under pressure or in a very difficult situation that you really see the mettle of the people around you. Yeah. And that goes for relationships as well. That goes into every aspect of life. But for example, my own company were amazing when my mum suddenly passed away at the very start of this year. And, that was a situation I never imagined that would happen. There was certainly nothing in the handbook about, how it would be handled. But that sort of support and that real wonderful compassion that my company gave me has made me feel so committed to them and feels like... I want to do a good job and I feel supported. And because I feel supported, I am able to perform well. Yeah. So forgive the slight personal sidetrack, but I do think it accounts for all industry, law firms included.
It does, definitely. And I think, again, I think particularly in law where you don't necessarily have, that support, even on a kind of daily level in some firms,
these things really matter to
they
all
really
employees.
Do. They really do. And I think that's part of the whole kind of retention issue as well. it's nice to be paid high, but if actually, that's the only benefit you get. You're only going to be there for 2-3 years and then you're going to go. And what you want is a success story that's built on the long term. And that's the daily tiny little things, gestures that you can do for your staff that actually makes their life better at work.
Absolutely.
Especially in situations that are stressful, whether that's personal life or work, really. It's been a lovely episode, Rose. Thank you for all your lovely contributions and for joining me today. And to everyone, we'll be back next week for another episode. We're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And thank you for joining.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.